Good Erev Shabbos, everyone. Because the last video message I sent out to the community was so well received and we got such overwhelming positive feedback on it, we decided to do another one, video 2.0. Hopefully in this case the sequel will be better than the original. I want to start by thanking you all. I know that this has been a long and difficult process, and I can't tell you how honored and humbled I am to have been selected as the next rabbi of Congregation B'nai Yeshurun. Rena and I are so excited to join the community, to get to meet you all, to get to know you all, and to begin to work together on the future of this very special shul. I want to take a moment to also commend Rabbis Zev Goldberg and Yoni Golker. Unfortunately, we all too frequently see grave Chilul Hashem connected to contests over rabbinic leadership, yeshivas that are torn apart over succession crises, Hasidic dynasties that splinter into two after the passing of a Rebbe. And I want you all to know that the interactions between the three of us throughout this entire process, up to and including today, could not have possibly been further from those unfortunate paradigms. Rabbis Goldberg and Golker are amazing people, amazing Jews, amazing Rabbanim. Klal Yisrael is so lucky to have them. And as I expressed to each of them privately, and I now say to everyone publicly, I genuinely hope that we will have opportunities to cross paths in the future. To all of my Einstein congregants who will inevitably end up watching this video, I want you to know that while, as I wrote in the email that I sent to our community on Wednesday night, it is genuinely sad to be parting from you all, I only consider this to be a temporary parting, because once you are finished with residency and once you're finished with fellowship, unless you're making Aliyah and going to Eretz Yisrael, you're coming to Teaneck and you're davening in B'nai Yeshurun. Period. End of conversation. Consider it a psak. This past Wednesday, we observed the somber commemoration of Yom HaZikaron. And on Yom HaZikaron, I shared with some of my students the by now legendary story of Mikey Levi. I'm sure many are familiar with Mikey's story. There was a documentary, A Hero in Heaven, that was released on his life story a few years back. And he has more generally become an Israeli hero in accordance with the immense stature of the gevura, self-sacrifice, and commitment to Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael that he lived his life by. But in case anyone is unfamiliar, Mikey was a normal American kid, grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. In his early life, he didn't really stand out from other American Jewish kids. He lived life with the standard hopes and joys, fears and anxieties of other Jewish adolescents. And nobody at the time pinned him as somehow unique or special. But Mikey was unique and special. He lived with an acute awareness of his family's and his nation's history. Mikey's grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and after high school, he made Aliyah. He enlisted in Tzahal as a lone soldier, and he joined the paratroopers, the Tzanchanim. There are many amazing stories about Mikey. How he got into the Tzanchanim in the first place is remarkable. Initially, they didn't take him seriously because of his diminutive stature. He was short, he was skinny, but he persisted, he proved his mettle, he earned his place. But perhaps the most inspiring story about Mikey was the story of his passing and the heroic self-sacrifice he made for Am Yisrael. In the summer of 2006, the Milchemet HaLebanon HaShniyah, the second Lebanon war with Hezbollah, broke out in the north of Israel. The Milchemet HaLebanon HaShniyah was a tough war for Israel. I remember personally, I spent a year in Israel in 2007, 2008, and many of the Israelis who had served were still deeply scarred from their experiences in the war. And Mikey was actually with his parents in the States when the fighting broke out. He was not in Israel. He, of course, heard about the fighting. He heard that his unit was called up and insisted on returning to Israel, with the war already raging, to serve with his brothers in arms in defense of the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland. And soon after, in an intense firefight, Mikey was shot and killed, giving his life for the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland. Hashem Yinkom Damav. The memory of Mikey and so many others like him came to me this week, not only on Yom HaZikaron, but also as I reviewed this week's Parsha, Tazria-Metzora, which we will read in shul tomorrow. Parshat Tazria-Metzora primarily deals with the ailment of tzaras, a kind of spiritual leprosy that physically manifested as skin lesions on the body of the afflicted. The Torah tells us in Vayikra Perek Yud Gimel Pasuk Mem Vav, Kol Yemei Asher Hanega Bo Yitma Tamehu. For the entire time that the skin lesion is present on his body, he is tameh, he is impure. Badad Yeshev Michutz LaMachane Moshava. He shall sit badad, alone. He shall dwell outside of the camp. Soloveitchik pointed out that in truth the word badad can be translated in two different ways, into one of two English words that are superficially similar, but radically different in character. Badad can mean alone, or it can mean lonely. At the beginning of his classic essay, The Lonely Man of Faith, Soloveitchik spells out the difference between the two. The word aloneness is a physical or social characterization. I'm alone when I am not surrounded by others. Man in the desert, in a vast emptiness, is alone. By contrast, loneliness is a psychological, emotional, or as Rav Soloveitchik would have it, existential state. One can be surrounded by friends and colleagues and nonetheless feel lonely. In the words of Rav Soloveitchik, companionship and friendship do not alleviate the passional experience of loneliness, which trails me constantly. And many times the word badad means both. At the beginning of Megillas Eicha, we declare, Eicha yashava badad. How has it come to pass that Yerushalayim sits lonely and alone, betrayed by all who once loved her? Bilam declares, Hein am levadad yishkon, that the Bnei Yisrael are a nation that dwells alone. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, Zechron Levracha, once said that if you look at the United Nations and its absurd and unjust treatment of the state of Israel, you see that we are indeed a nation that dwells alone. And so sits the Metzora, outside the camp, lonely and alone, left to contemplate the sins that led to his spiritual ailment and to hopefully atone for them. But there are other times when the word badad connotes one but not the other. Times when it means that someone is alone but does not suffer from the emotional and existential loneliness that often comes with it. In Israel, the term for a lone soldier is a chayal boded, the same word as the badad that appears in this week's parsha. And I can assure you that while a chayal boded is a lone soldier, he is never a lonely soldier. My first cousin, really Reno's first cousin, a young man named Moshe Schwartz, often reflects on his experiences as a chayal boded in Eretz Yisrael. Moshe is a special guy. He was a regular modern Orthodox kid, grew up down Route 80 in Passaic, who decided that after high school he was going to join the Yeshivat Hesder of Sderot and serve in Tzahal. He applied to serve in the Tzanchanim. He was initially rejected because his Hebrew wasn't good enough. He went back and studied some Ulpan, and then he was accepted, and he served. And he often reflects that even though he was a lone soldier, a chayal boded, he was effectively adopted by every single family in Eretz Yisrael. Every single family wanted to welcome him for a Shabbos meal, offer him lodging on an extra mattress in their basement, offer him their granddaughter's hand in marriage. He served as a lone soldier, but he was never, ever lonely. And going back to Mikey Levi, when Mikey's father boarded a plane to attend his son's funeral at the Har Herzl Military Cemetery in Yerushalayim, to be buried with all the other Giborim Ukedoshim who have served Ha'am v'Ha'aretz, he was initially afraid that nobody else would be there. He had no friends or relatives in Israel. Nobody was traveling. It was a time of conflict. He didn't know if anyone would come. But thousands of people, thousands, came to Mikey's funeral, came to pay their final respects to this Jewish hero. Because Mikey, too, was perhaps a lone soldier, but he was never truly lonely or even alone. I think this past year we were in new ways exposed to the challenges of aloneness and loneliness. Many of us faced long stretches of being alone, and indeed the modern Hebrew word for quarantine is bidud. But we as a community and as a people tried to ensure that aloneness never translated to loneliness. We sought to ensure that those who were physically isolated nonetheless felt the presence and love of family and friends. We sought to ensure that physical distance never became spiritual or emotional distance. We sought to ensure that even as we were apart, we remained united. And I ask that we tap into those same energies now, as a united community, as we move forward into the future of Congregation B'nai Yeshurun. That just as we transcended barriers of space and distance, we together seek to transcend other barriers that from time to time arise between us. That we move into the future with optimism and confidence, knowing that we can and will bring Congregation B'nai Yeshurun to new and unprecedented heights. But only if we do so together. I wish you all a wonderful Shabbos, and I look forward to seeing you all soon.